November 1951. The hillside near Pyongyang. Park Jun-ho pressed his face into frozen mud and waited to die. His fingers had gone numb hours ago. The radio equipment he'd been carrying lay shattered 30 meters downslope, torn apart by machine gun fire that had killed everyone else in his unit. Above him, American voices shouted commands he couldn't understand. Boots crunched through frost-brittle grass. He could smell diesel exhaust and cordite and his own fierce sweat despite the cold. They said the Americans skinned prisoners alive. They said the imperialists were animals who enjoyed torture, who cut off fingers and fed captured soldiers to dogs. Park had believed this. He was 21 years old and had believed everything the party told him since he was 14, since the orphanage took him in after his mother died and gave him purpose, education, certainty. Now he lay in the mud waiting for the skinning to begin. A boot nudged his ribs. Not a kick, just pressure. Park didn't move. His orders had been clear. Fight to the death, never surrender. But everyone else was dead and he was alone, and the radio was destroyed and his ammunition was gone, and he was so tired. "Hey." The voice was American, flat and nasal. "You alive?" Park kept his eyes shut. Maybe if he pretended to be dead. The boot nudged again, harder. "I can see you breathing, kid. Get up. Hands where I can see them." Park opened his eyes. A soldier stood over him. Tall, wearing a helmet with netting and camouflage. Rifle pointed at Park's chest, but not pressed against him. The soldier's face was pale, stubbled, exhausted. He looked maybe 25. He didn't look like he was planning to skin anyone. "Up," the soldier repeated, gesturing with the rifle barrel. Park raised his hands slowly and struggled to his knees. His legs shook. He'd been lying in the cold for 3 hours, waiting for darkness that never came, for courage that never arrived, for death that was apparently taking its time. The American gestured again. Park stood. 3 more soldiers appeared from the tree line, weapons ready but not firing. One of them, shorter and stockier, walked over and patted Park down efficiently. He found nothing. Park's pistol had jammed 2 days ago, and he'd thrown it away in frustration. "Clean," the stocky one said. He had a Chicago accent, though Park wouldn't learn that until later. "Just a kid with a busted radio." The tall soldier lowered his rifle slightly. "Can you walk?" Park stared at him. The question made no sense. Of course he could walk. Why would they care if he could walk? Unless they needed him mobile for the torture. Unless they were taking him somewhere specific for the skinning. "Walk," the soldier repeated, slower, gesturing down the hill toward where American vehicles were clustered. Park walked, his legs moved, the soldiers followed. Nobody shot him, nobody cut anything off. They just walked down the hill through the cold November afternoon, and Park waited for the moment when the pretense would end and the real treatment would begin. It didn't come. They put him in a truck with 11 other prisoners, all North Korean, all young, all terrified. Nobody spoke. The truck bed smelled like canvas and vomit. Someone had been sick earlier. The guards sat at the tailgate, rifles across their laps, not even looking at the prisoners. One of them smoked a cigarette. The other hummed something under his breath, barely audible over the engine noise. Park sat near the front of the truck bed and tried to control his breathing. His mind raced through everything he'd been taught. The Americans would separate them. They would interrogate them individually. They would use pain and humiliation to break their spirits. They would try to turn them against the party, against the motherland. He had to resist. He had to remember his training. But they'd also said the Americans were stupid, clumsy, unable to coordinate military operations. They'd said American soldiers were soft, raised on luxury and excess, incapable of real hardship. Park had seen those soldiers move through the hills. They weren't clumsy. They weren't soft. They'd outmaneuvered his entire unit in 6 hours. What else had been wrong? The truck drove for 90 minutes, jouncing over bad roads, through checkpoints Park couldn't see. Then it stopped. The guards stood and gestured for the prisoners to climb out. Park jumped down onto gravel. They were at some kind of compound, temporary looking, surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Tents stretched in rows. American soldiers moved between them with the casual efficiency of people doing familiar work. In the distance, Park could hear generators humming. A sergeant approached. Older than the others, maybe 35, with a hard face and gray eyes that swept over the prisoners without expression. He spoke to the guards briefly, then gestured toward a large tent. "Processing," he said in English, then in terrible Korean, butchered but understandable. "You go. No problem. Just questions." Processing. Interrogation. Here it came. But it wasn't interrogation. Not really. They took his name, his unit, his rank, which was basically nothing. Radio operator, enlisted, no command position. They photographed him. They checked him for wounds and found only frostbite on 3 fingers. An American medic, a black soldier with gentle hands, wrapped the fingers in gauze and gave Park 2 aspirin and a cup of water. The medic smiled briefly. Park didn't understand why. Then they took him to a barracks tent and pointed at a cot. "Sleep," the sergeant said, still in that terrible Korean. "Food coming." Park sat on the cot. It had a thin mattress and 2 wool blankets. It was cleaner than anywhere he'd slept in 4 months. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same thing, sitting in stunned silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't drop. Food came an hour later. Not much, but more than Park had eaten in a week. Rice, some kind of stew with actual meat in it, bread. American bread, soft and white and strange. Park ate slowly, expecting someone to take it away. Nobody did. The man on the cot next to him was older, maybe 30, with a scar across his left cheek. He ate without looking up. When he finished, he finally spoke, voice low. "I'm Kim Dae-jung, artillery, captured yesterday." Park nodded. "Park Jun-ho, radio." "They haven't hurt you?" "No." "Me neither." Kim wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I don't understand it." Park didn't either. He lay back on the cot and stared at the canvas ceiling. Outside, he could hear Americans talking, laughing, moving around. Normal sounds, human sounds. It made no sense. He fell asleep waiting for the torture to begin. It took 3 days for Park to understand that the torture wasn't coming. There were no interrogations beyond the basic processing, no beatings, no humiliation. The guards were professional but not cruel. They watched the prisoners, maintained order, enforced rules, but they didn't seem interested in causing pain. The rules were simple. Stay in your assigned area, line up for meals, work details rotated daily, no fighting. That was it. Park was assigned to kitchen duty on the 3rd day. He peeled potatoes alongside 4 other prisoners under the supervision of an American private who couldn't have been older than 19. The private's name was Kowalski. He had dark hair and a long face, and he hummed while he worked, constantly, tunelessly. "You speak English?" Kowalski asked midway through the morning. Park shook his head. He understood some. Radio operators learned basic English for technical purposes, but he wasn't about to reveal that. Kowalski shrugged and went back to humming. The potatoes kept coming. Park's hands moved automatically, peeling, dropping them in the bucket, reaching for another. His mind wandered. He thought about his unit, about the men who'd died on that hillside. He thought about the orphanage, about the certainty he'd felt when the party representatives came and told him he could serve the motherland. He thought about his mother who'd died when he was 13 before the war, before any of this. She used to sing while she worked. Old songs, folk songs about mountains and rivers and lost love. Park hadn't thought about those songs in years. The party didn't encourage that kind of sentimentality. Personal memory was selfish. The collective was what mattered. But here, peeling potatoes in an enemy camp, his mother's voice came back to him clearly. The melody, the words, the way she'd paused between verses. He shook his head hard. Dangerous thinking. Weakness. Kowalski looked over. "You okay?" Park didn't respond. He peeled faster. That night, after dinner, after the prisoners had been counted and dismissed to their tents, something new happened. A group of American soldiers carried a large object into the center of the compound and set it down on a wooden platform. It took Park a moment to recognize what it was. A radio, not a military radio, not communications equipment. A civilian radio, large and wooden, with a dial and a speaker grill. The Americans fiddled with it for a few minutes, running a wire to a generator. Then one of them turned it on. Static crackled, then music. Park had heard American music before, briefly, intercepting broadcasts while on radio duty. He'd been taught it was degenerate, primitive, the sound of a morally corrupt society. Jazz was African primitivism. Blues was the wailing of an inferior culture. Rock and roll was sexual degeneracy weaponized. But he'd never heard it like this, clear, close, unavoidable. The song was slow, mournful. A woman's voice, deep and textured, singing words Park couldn't fully understand but whose emotion was unmistakable. Sadness, longing, loss. Around the compound, American soldiers paused in whatever they were doing. Some sat down on the ground. Others leaned against fence posts. They listened with expressions Park recognized, not joy, not entertainment, but something deeper. Connection, memory. One of them, the sergeant who'd processed Park on the first day, sat on a crate near the radio. His name was Callahan, Park had learned. He was from Nebraska. He'd been in Korea for 11 months. He looked at the radio like it was showing him something he'd forgotten existed. Park stood near the tent entrance, watching. Other prisoners emerged slowly, curious or wary, or both. Kim Dae-jung appeared next to Park. "What is this?" Kim asked quietly. "Propaganda," Park said automatically. "Psychological warfare. Doesn't sound like propaganda." It didn't. That was the problem. Propaganda was supposed to be obvious, blatant, full of lies wrapped in false promises. This was just music. Sad music. Human music. The song ended. Another began. This one was different. Male voice, accompanied by guitar, singing about trains and traveling and missing someone. The melody was simple but effective. It worked its way into Park's head immediately, unwanted but persistent. Kowalski, the private from kitchen duty, sat down near the radio. He sang along quietly, knowing every word. Another soldier joined him, then another. They weren't performing. They were just singing. Like it mattered, like the songs meant something. Park turned away abruptly and went into the tent. He lay on his cot and covered his ears. But the music leaked through anyway, soft, insistent, carrying across the cold November air. The woman's voice came back. Different song now, slower, even sadder. Park caught fragments of words. Don't know why. No sun up in the sky, stormy weather. His mother used to sing on rainy days. She said the rain made her remember her own mother, who had died young. She said memory was carried in sound, that voices outlived bodies. Park pressed his palms harder against his ears. This was manipulation. This was the enemy trying to make him weak, trying to make him forget who he was and what he believed. But the melody stayed with him anyway. All night. Even after the radio was turned off and the compound fell silent. Even after sleep finally came. The music stayed. And Park Jun-ho, lying in the dark in an enemy prison camp, realized with cold certainty that something inside him had just begun to crack. The radio played every evening at 1800 hours. Park learned to anticipate it the way he'd once anticipated artillery barrages, with dread and inevitability. By the end of the first week, he'd stopped covering his ears. There was no point. The music carried across the entire compound. It leaked through canvas walls and settled into the cold air like fog. Even when Park tried to focus on other things, the taste of dinner, the ache in his frostbitten fingers, the conversation of other prisoners, the music was there, underneath everything, constant and unavoidable. The Americans seemed to need it. That was what unsettled Park most. Not that they played music to torture prisoners or demonstrate superiority, but that they played it for themselves. They gathered around the radio like it was a fire in winter. They sat in silence or sang along quietly. They closed their eyes and swayed slightly, lost in something Park couldn't name. On the 8th night, Kowalski sat down next to Park during the broadcast. Park had been standing near the fence line, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The private appeared without warning, hands in his pockets. breath misting in the November cold. "You listen every night?" Kowalski said. Not a question, an observation. Park said nothing. "But you don't like it?" "It's enemy music," Park replied in English before he could stop himself. Kowalski's eyebrows rose. "You do speak English?" Park cursed internally. Stupid, careless. But Kowalski didn't seem angry or suspicious. He just looked interested. "Yeah, I guess it is enemy music," Kowalski said after a moment. "Never thought of it that way. It's just music, you know, the stuff we grew up with." The current song was instrumental. Piano and saxophone, slow and melancholic. Park didn't recognize it. He'd been taught that jazz was chaos pretending to be art, but this didn't sound chaotic. It sounded structured, intentional, like someone had built something beautiful out of sadness. "What's it about?" Park asked, then immediately regretted it. Showing interest was showing weakness, but Kowalski didn't smirk or use it against him. He just listened for a moment, head tilted. "This one? It's called Round Midnight, Thelonious Monk. It's about—" He paused, searching for words. "Being alone in a city at night, missing someone. That feeling when you can't sleep because your head won't stop thinking." Park understood that feeling. He'd felt it every night since capture. "The saxophone is like a voice," Kowalski continued, "saying things words can't say. You hear that part?" He pointed toward the radio as the saxophone climbed higher, note by note. "That's longing. That's, I wish things were different, but they're not." Park wanted to argue that music couldn't say things, that it was just sound, organized vibration without meaning. But his mother's voice came back to him again, singing on rainy days, carrying emotion that words alone couldn't hold. "Why do you play it here?" Park asked quietly. "Why for prisoners?" Kowalski shrugged. "We're not playing it for you. We're playing it for us. You guys just happened to be here." He pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Park. Park shook his head. Kowalski lit his own and exhaled slowly. "We've been here 11 months. Some guys longer. We're tired. We miss home. The music, it helps." "Helps what?" "Helps us remember we're human, I guess." The phrase hung in the cold air between them. Park turned it over in his mind, looking for the propaganda angle, the manipulation, but Kowalski's face showed nothing but exhaustion and a kind of sad honesty. The song ended. Another began. This one had vocals, male, rough-edged, singing about a house and a woman and coming home. "Hank Williams," Kowalski said. "Guy died 2 years ago. Car accident. He was 29. He smoked and listened. This song is about missing your girl, simple as that. He's somewhere far away, she's back home, and he just wants to be with her. That's it. That's the whole song." Park listened despite himself. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but the voice carried weight, genuine emotion that even language barriers couldn't hide. "You got someone back home?" Kowalski asked suddenly. Park stiffened. Personal questions were interrogation. But Kowalski wasn't looking at him like an interrogator. He was looking at him like someone making conversation. "My mother," Park said finally. "She died before the war." "I'm sorry." Kowalski's voice was quiet. "My dad died when I was 16. Heart attack, right in the middle of dinner." He took another drag. "Songs about missing people hit different when you've lost someone, you know?" Park did know. That was the problem. He knew exactly what Kowalski meant. They stood in silence while Hank Williams sang about loneliness and distance and the unbearable weight of separation. Around the compound, other soldiers listened with the same expressions Park was learning to recognize. Not happiness, not entertainment, just recognition. Connection to something beyond the cold and the war and the endless separation from everything they loved. "The party says this music is degenerate," Park heard himself say, "that it weakens the spirit." Kowalski laughed, but not unkindly. "Maybe it does. Maybe that's the point. Maybe being weak sometimes is what keeps you human." He walked away before Park could respond, leaving him alone with the music and the thought that wouldn't leave. What if being strong all the time was just another way of being broken? The work details became easier after that. Not physically, Park still peeled potatoes and hauled water and helped dig drainage ditches in frozen ground, but mentally, because Kowalski talked while they worked, explaining things Park hadn't asked about but somehow needed to hear. During potato duty, Kowalski told him about Chicago, about growing up in a neighborhood where half the people spoke Polish and the other half spoke Italian, and everyone argued about whose grandmother made better pierogi or pasta, about working in his uncle's butcher shop before the war, about his girlfriend, Mary, who worked at a telephone switchboard and wrote him letters twice a week. She sends pictures sometimes, Kowalski said, showing Park a worn photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile. That was taken at her sister's wedding last summer. See how she's looking away from the camera? She hates having her picture taken. Park looked at the photograph and felt something twist in his chest. The woman looked like someone who existed, someone real, not an abstract enemy or an ideological construct. Someone's daughter, someone's girlfriend. Someone who mattered to the man standing next to Park, peeling potatoes in a Korean winter. "Do you miss her?" Park asked. "Every goddamn day." Kowalski tucked the photograph back in his jacket pocket carefully. "When they send us home, I'm going to marry her. Already bought the ring before I shipped out. It's at my mom's house." Park tried to imagine that life, going home, marrying someone, having a future beyond war. He couldn't. His future had been defined by the party since he was 14. Serve the motherland, fight the imperialists, sacrifice for the collective. There had never been room for girlfriends or weddings or personal desires. "What about you?" Kowalski asked. "You got plans? After this?" "I'm a prisoner," Park said flatly. "I don't get plans." "Yeah, but eventually there'll be an exchange or an armistice or something. You'll go home. Then what?" Park had no answer. Home was a concept that had become increasingly abstract. The orphanage where he'd grown up, the party offices where he'd been trained, the military barracks where he'd learned radio operation. None of those places felt like home. Home had died with his mother. That night the radio played a different kind of music. Blues, slow and raw, about pain that went deeper than words. The singer's voice was old, weathered, carrying decades of hardship in every note. "Muddy Waters," someone said. "Louisiana Blues." Park stood near the radio without meaning to. The song was about missing home, about rivers and fields and the specific ache of displacement. The singer hadn't just left home. He'd been forced out, pushed away by circumstances beyond his control. And now he was somewhere else, somewhere cold and foreign, remembering warmth and belonging and everything he'd lost. Park understood every word without understanding a single word. Sergeant Callahan appeared next to him. The older man had been watching Park all week. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the attention of someone who recognized something familiar. "This song gets me every time," Callahan said quietly. "Reminds me of the farm. Reminds me of my brother." Park glanced at him. Callahan had never mentioned a brother. "James?" Callahan continued, eyes on the radio. 2 years younger than me, he enlisted same day I did. We went through basic together, shipped out together." He paused. "He's a prisoner too. North Korean camp, somewhere near the Yalu River. I got his name on a Red Cross list 6 months ago. That's all I know. He's alive, that's it." The information settled over Park like weight. Callahan's brother was in a North Korean camp, being held by Park's people. Treated how? Fed how? Beaten? Starved? The propaganda said North Korean camps were humane, following all international laws. But Park had learned enough in the past 2 weeks to question everything the propaganda said. "I think about him every day," Callahan said. "Wonder what he's eating, if he's warm, if he's hurt, if—" He stopped. "If he's still alive." Park felt his throat tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" Callahan looked at him directly. "Because you need to understand something. We're enemies. That's the situation. But that doesn't mean I hate you. It doesn't mean I want you to suffer. My brother is probably sitting in a camp just like this one, listening to some guard talk about missing home. I hope that guard treats him okay. I hope someone over there is decent to him." The implication was clear. Callahan was being decent to Park because he hoped someone was being decent to James. Park didn't know what to say. The concept was alien to everything he'd been taught. The enemy was the enemy. There was no room for mutual humanity, no space for hope that transcended ideology. But here it was anyway. Sergeant Thomas Callahan from Nebraska, standing in a Korean prison camp, telling a North Korean radio operator about his brother because some part of him needed Park to understand that they were all just people caught in something larger than themselves. The blues song ended. Another began. This one was faster, angrier, about injustice and suffering and the refusal to give up despite everything. The singer's voice was fierce, defiant, carrying rage that felt earned and righteous. "That's what I like about blues," Callahan said. "It doesn't pretend things are okay. It doesn't lie to you. It just says, 'This hurts,' and keeps going anyway." Park thought about his mother again. Her songs had been like that too. Sad songs about loss and hardship, but she'd sung them anyway, transforming pain into something that could be shared, witnessed, survived. "Music is memory," Park said quietly, not meaning to speak aloud. Callahan nodded. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." They stood together in silence while the radio played and the compound settled into night, and Park felt the certainty of his indoctrination continuing to crack, piece by piece, note by note. Kim Dae-jung cornered Park 3 days later during the evening meal. The older man's face was hard, his voice low and urgent. "You're spending too much time with them." Park looked up from his rice. "I'm on work detail. I don't have a choice." "You have a choice about listening, about talking, about—" Kim gestured vaguely toward where Kowalski and Callahan sat with other Americans. "About becoming one of them." "I'm not becoming anything," Park said sharply. "No? You speak English now. You know their names. You listen to their music without fighting it. You smile when they talk to you." Kim leaned closer. "You're forgetting who you are." Park wanted to argue, but the words stuck. Because Kim wasn't entirely wrong. Park was changing. He could feel it happening, slow and irreversible, like ice melting in spring. "They're the enemy," Kim continued. "They invaded our country. They're killing our people. The fact that they feed us and play music doesn't change that." "I know who they are," Park said quietly. "Do you? Because from here it looks like you're starting to see them as human. That's how they win. Not with bullets. With this." Kim gestured toward the radio. "With kindness and music and making you forget that they're imperialists who want to destroy everything we've built." Park set down his bowl. "What if they're not trying to make me forget? What if they're just people?" Kim's expression hardened. "There are no just people in war. There's us and them. Choosing anything else is betrayal." He walked away before Park could respond, leaving Park alone with his half-eaten meal and the terrible suspicion that Kim was right, that Park was betraying something, though he was no longer certain what. That night, the radio played a song Park hadn't heard before. Slow, intimate, a woman's voice singing about love and loss and the impossible distance between what was and what could have been. "Billie Holiday," someone said. "I'll be seeing you." The lyrics were simple but devastating. The singer promised to see someone in all the old familiar places, in the morning sun, in the moon at night, in everything beautiful and ordinary. But the subtext was clear. She wouldn't actually see them. The person was gone. The promise was memory, nothing more. Kowalski sat down next to Park without asking permission. They'd fallen into this routine over the past week. Working together, eating together, listening together. Kowalski translated lyrics when Park asked. Park asked more often now. "What is she singing about?" Park asked quietly. Kowalski listened for a moment. "Separation. Someone she loves is far away. Maybe dead. She's saying she'll remember them in everything she sees. It's a goodbye that never ends." Park felt his chest tighten. His mother had said something similar before she died. "I'll be in the rain," she'd whispered, fever bright and fading. "When you hear the rain, you'll hear me." "It's a war song," Kowalski continued. Billy recorded it during World War II, for soldiers who weren't coming home, for the people waiting for them. He was quiet for a moment. Mary played this at her father's funeral. He died at Normandy. She said it was the only song that made sense. Park turned and looked at Kowalski directly. Really looked at him. The private was young, maybe 20, same age as Park. He had a girlfriend he wanted to marry, and a dead father and a life waiting back in Chicago that the war had interrupted. He peeled potatoes and hummed constantly and explained music to enemy prisoners because it helped him remember what normal felt like. He was exactly like Park. The realization hit like physical impact, not similar, not comparable, exactly the same. A young man caught in a war he didn't start, missing people he loved, trying to survive until he could go home to a life that might not even exist anymore. "Why are you kind to us?" Park asked suddenly. Kowalski looked surprised. "What do you mean? You could be cruel. You could treat us like animals. We're your enemies. But you—" Park struggled for words. "You talk to us. You share pictures. You explain things. Why?" Kowalski was silent for a long moment. Billie Holiday sang about small cafes and morning walks and all the ordinary moments that became unbearable when you lost someone. "Because I'm terrified of what they're doing to us," Kowalski said finally. His voice was barely audible. "The Chinese camps, the North Korean camps. I'm terrified that American prisoners are being tortured or starved or worse. And I can't do anything about it. I can't help them." He looked at Park. "But I can be decent to you. I can make sure that at least some prisoners in this war are treated like human beings. Maybe." His voice cracked slightly. "Maybe if I do that, someone somewhere is doing the same for our guys." It was the same logic Callahan had used, the same desperate hope that decency was transitive, that kindness rippled outward, that treating enemies well somehow protected your own people across vast distances. Park felt something break inside him completely. Not his loyalty to the party or his belief in the motherland. Something deeper. The certainty that the world was divided cleanly into us and them, good and evil, right and wrong. Because Kowalski was supposed to be evil, the imperialist invader, the enemy. But instead, he was just a scared kid from Chicago who missed his girlfriend and hoped desperately that his decency mattered. "I hope your brother is safe," Park said quietly to Callahan, who had appeared nearby. Callahan looked at him for a long moment. "I hope your people are safe too." The song ended. The radio played static for a few seconds before the next track began. In that brief silence, Park understood what had happened. The music hadn't brainwashed him or broken his will. It had simply shown him that the people he'd been taught to hate felt exactly what he felt. Fear, longing, love, loss, hope. The enemy's sadness sounded exactly like his own sadness. Their loneliness was his loneliness. Their humanity was undeniable because it was identical to his. Hank Williams began singing, "I'm so lonesome I could cry." The lyrics were devastating in their simplicity. The singer was so lonely that even natural beauty hurt. The moon made him sad. Birds made him sad. Everything reminded him of being utterly alone. Park began translating for Kim, who had returned and was sitting silently nearby. "He says he's so lonely he could cry. He says time moves slowly when you're alone. He says a robin's song is sadder than tears." Kim listened without expression. When the song ended, he spoke quietly. "They feel it too," Kim said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Park replied. "Everything we were told about them was wrong." Kim was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was hollow. "How do we go back, after this? How do we go home and pretend we never learned what they're really like?" Park had no answer. Because Kim was right. This knowledge was permanent, irreversible. They could never unknow that the enemy was human, that the imperialists cried when they missed home, that American music carried the same loneliness Korean music carried. The radio played on into the night. Park sat and listened and felt the weight of understanding settle over him like snow. Heavy, cold, inescapable. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And the worst part was that he wasn't sorry. July 27, 1953. The word came at morning roll call. Armistice. The war was over. Not won, not lost. Just over. Frozen in place along a line that barely differed from where it had started 3 years earlier. The fighting would stop. Prisoners would be exchanged. Park stood in formation and felt nothing. Around him, other prisoners reacted with visible emotion. Relief, fear, confusion. Kim Dae-jung's hands shook. A younger prisoner started crying. But Park felt only a strange hollowness, as if the news had happened to someone else. Sergeant Callahan addressed them in his terrible Korean, better now after 20 months, but still heavily accented. You go home soon. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Prepare yourselves. Home. The word meant nothing, everything. The compound changed immediately. The routine that had governed their lives for nearly 2 years began to dissolve. Work details became optional. The guards relaxed their vigilance. Prisoners moved more freely, though most stayed close to their barracks, uncertain what freedom meant when it was temporary and conditional. The radio still played every evening. If anything, the music became more frequent, longer sessions that stretched late into the night. The Americans seemed to need it more now, as if the approaching end made them more desperate to hold on to something familiar. Park found Kowalski behind the kitchen tent 3 days after the announcement. The private was sitting on an empty crate, smoking and staring at nothing. He looked older than he had in November. They all did. You're going home, Park said in English. It came naturally now after months of conversation. Kowalski nodded slowly. Yeah, Chicago. Mary, my mom, the butcher shop. He said it like he was trying to convince himself it still existed. You? North, Pyongyang probably, re-education, then... Park shrugged. Then what? Return to radio operations? Return to the party? Return to certainty he no longer possessed? They sat in silence. 2 young men who should have been enemies, who were enemies technically, who had somehow become something else entirely, without either of them meaning to. I'm scared, Kowalski admitted quietly. Park looked at him, surprised. I'm scared I won't fit anymore, that I've changed too much, that Mary won't recognize me. Kowalski took a long drag on his cigarette. I'm scared I'll get home and realize I left part of myself here. Park understood exactly. He was terrified of the same thing, that he'd return to North Korea carrying knowledge that would mark him forever as different. Dangerous, contaminated by enemy thinking. What will you tell them? Park asked. About us, about the prisoners. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. The truth, I guess. That you were just guys. Scared kids mostly. That you weren't what we expected. He looked at Park. What will you tell them? About us? Park thought about that. What could he possibly say? That the imperialist invaders treated prisoners humanely? That American soldiers cried when they missed home? That enemy music carried the same loneliness as revolutionary songs? Any of that would be enough to end his life or condemn him to a labor camp. Nothing, Park said finally. I'll tell them nothing. Kowalski nodded slowly, understanding what that meant. That's probably smart. They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, smoking in silence, and Park felt the weight of approaching separation like physical pressure. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, he would never see Eddie Kowalski again. Never hear him hum while working. Never listen to him explain songs or show pictures of Mary, or talk about Chicago like it was the center of the universe. The loss felt unbearable, which made no sense. Kowalski was the enemy. They should be celebrating separation, not mourning it, but they mourned anyway. Sergeant Callahan found Park 5 days before the scheduled exchange. The older man looked tired, worn down by 20 months in Korea and the approaching end that should have been a relief but felt like an ending of something important. Walk with me, Callahan said. They walked the perimeter of the compound, past guard towers that would be abandoned soon, past wire fencing that would be cut down and repurposed, past the radio that had played music every evening for 20 months. I got word about my brother, Callahan said abruptly. Red Cross notification. He's alive. He's on the exchange list. Park felt relief flood through him. That's good. He was in a camp near Sinuiju. They moved him around a lot. Callahan paused. He was treated okay. Not great, but okay. They fed him. They didn't. He stopped again, struggling. Someone over there was decent to him. Someone made sure he survived. Park heard what Callahan wasn't saying. Someone had done for James Callahan what Thomas Callahan had done for Park. The decency had been transitive after all. The desperate hope had been rewarded, at least partially. I wanted to thank you, Callahan said quietly. I didn't do anything, Park replied, confused. You let me be decent without making it complicated. You let me believe that treating you well mattered, that it meant something. Callahan looked at him directly. My brother survived because someone over there made the same choice I made, to see prisoners as human, to be kind when cruelty would have been easier. Park didn't know what to say. He'd done nothing except exist, except survive, except slowly recognize that his captors were people, but somehow that had been enough to mean something. What will you do? Callahan asked. When you get home? Park had thought about this constantly for days. Survive, stay quiet, remember. Remember what? That you were human, that the enemy felt what I felt, that music carries truth propaganda can't erase. Park's voice dropped. That everything I was taught was wrong. Callahan was quiet for a long moment. That's dangerous knowledge. I know. Will you be safe? Park laughed bitterly. No, but I'll be careful. They reached the radio. Someone had already started packing it up for transport back to wherever it had come from. The wooden case sat open, wires coiled neatly inside. Soon it would be gone. The music would stop. The evenings would be silent again. I wish things were different, Callahan said suddenly. I wish we'd met some other way. I wish. He stopped, shook his head. I wish a lot of things. Park wished things too. Wished the war had never happened. Wished his mother hadn't died. Wished he'd never been taught to hate. Wished he could go home to Chicago with Kowalski or Nebraska with Callahan instead of returning to Pyongyang with secrets that could kill him. But wishing changed nothing. Your brother is lucky, Park said quietly, to have someone who hoped for him. Callahan looked at him with an expression Park couldn't read. So were you, whether you know it or not. He walked away before Park could respond, leaving him alone with the silent radio and the weight of everything unsaid. The night before the exchange, Kowalski found Park behind the barracks. It was late, after final roll call, after the compound had settled into sleep. The private carried something wrapped in canvas. I got you something, Kowalski said awkwardly. I know I'm not supposed to, but... He held out the package. Park took it carefully. Inside was paper, notebook paper, lined and cheap, covered in Kowalski's handwriting. Song lyrics, dozens of them. Round midnight. I'll be seeing you. Louisiana Blues. I'm so lonesome I could cry. All the songs that had played over 20 months, transcribed carefully with translations attempted in broken, phonetic Korean. I can't take this, Park whispered. If the party found it, if anyone saw it. Hide it, Kowalski urged. Memorize it and burn it if you have to. But I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to remember that this happened. That we... He struggled for words. That we were real. Park looked at the lyrics, at Kowalski's careful handwriting, at the evidence of months of work done in secret. This was dangerous. Keeping it was dangerous. But destroying it felt like erasure, like denying everything that had happened. I have something too, Park said suddenly. He pulled out a scrap of paper from his own pocket. On it, he'd written his mother's name in Korean characters, and below it, phonetically, the words to one of her songs, the one about rain and memory and voices that outlived bodies. For you, Park said, handing it to Kowalski. So you remember that we're not that different, that Korean mothers sing sad songs too. Kowalski took the paper like it was precious. I'll keep it. I'll show Mary. I'll tell her about you. Don't, Park said quickly. Don't tell anyone about me. It's safer if... I'll tell her there was a North Korean prisoner who taught me that the enemy was human. Kowalski interrupted firmly. That's important. People need to know that. Park wanted to argue but couldn't. Because Kowalski was right. Someone needed to carry this truth forward, even if Park couldn't. They stood in the darkness, two young men who had been enemies and had become something else, something without a name. Not friends exactly. Friendship implied equality they'd never had. Not just prisoner and guard. That didn't capture the weight of recognition, of shared humanity discovered across impossible divides. I'll miss you, Kowalski said quietly. That's fucked up, right? Missing an enemy? Yes, Park agreed. Very fucked up. They both laughed, quiet and sad. Then Kowalski did something Park didn't expect. He held out his hand. Park stared at it. In Korea, you didn't shake hands with enemies. In party doctrine, physical contact with imperialists was contamination. But Park took the hand anyway and shook it firmly. Take care of yourself, Park Junho. You too, Eddie Kowalski. Kowalski walked away into the darkness. Park stood alone, holding forbidden song lyrics and feeling his chest tight with grief for a loss that shouldn't matter but did. The exchange happened at Panmunjom, the village on the 38th parallel that had been designated neutral ground. Park was loaded onto a truck with 40 other prisoners at dawn. They drove for 6 hours through countryside that looked exactly like the Korea he remembered, but felt foreign now, like he was returning to a place he'd left too long ago. At the border, American soldiers transferred them to a holding area. On the other side of a cleared zone, North Korean soldiers waited. Park could see them through the wire, his people, his uniform, his flag. He should have felt relief, pride, homecoming. He felt terror. Sergeant Callahan appeared one final time, checking names on a clipboard. When he reached Park, he paused. Good luck, Callahan said quietly. Your brother, Park replied. Tell him someone hoped he was treated well. Callahan's eyes were bright. He nodded once, unable to speak. Then Park was walking across the cleared zone, away from the Americans, toward the North Korean soldiers who waited with expressions that promised nothing good. He walked with 40 others, all of them silent, all of them carrying secrets they could never speak. A North Korean officer processed them efficiently. Name, rank, unit, date of capture, standard questions. Park answered automatically, volunteering nothing. Around him, other returnees did the same. Everyone understood. Survival meant silence. They were loaded onto trucks, driven north, taken to a facility outside Pyongyang that Park recognized immediately, a re-education center. Not a prison exactly, but not freedom either. A place where returned prisoners would be observed, questioned, tested for ideological contamination. Park spent 6 weeks there. The process was methodical, exhausting. Daily interrogation, written statements, self-criticism sessions where prisoners confessed their ideological weakness and recommitted to party principles. Park said what he was supposed to say. He confessed to being captured instead of fighting to the death. He criticized his failure to resist enemy propaganda. He praised the party's mercy in accepting him back despite his unworthiness. He said nothing about music, nothing about Kowalski or Callahan, nothing about recognizing the enemy's humanity, nothing about song lyrics he'd memorized and burned before crossing the border. He passed. Eventually. The interrogators couldn't find proof of contamination beyond the act of survival itself, and too many prisoners had survived to punish them all. Park was released with a mark on his record, but no imprisonment. He was assigned to a radio repair shop in Pyongyang. Low-level work, beneath his training, but employment nonetheless. He survived. Years passed. 1954 became 1955, became 1960. Park kept his head down, worked his assigned job, said nothing controversial. He married in 1957, a quiet woman named Sun-Yi who asked few questions and accepted his silence about the war. They had a daughter in 1959. Park named her Min-jung, after his mother. He never spoke about the prison camp, about the Americans, about the music. The knowledge stayed locked inside him, dangerous and precious, a truth that could never be voiced but couldn't be forgotten. Sometimes at night he hummed, quietly, barely audible. melodies that had played from a radio in a prison camp 2 decades earlier. Soon Yi never asked about the songs. She'd learned not to ask. In 1968, Park's daughter was 10 years old. They were walking home from her school when she started singing, a children's song about spring flowers and sunshine. Her voice was clear and unself-conscious, carrying across the street without fear. Park stopped walking. Min Jung stopped too, looking at him with concern. "What's wrong, Appa?" Park looked at his daughter, at her open face and innocent voice, and felt 20 years of grief compress into a single moment. She sang without understanding that songs could be dangerous, that voices could carry forbidden truths, that melody was memory and memory was resistance. "Nothing," Park said quietly. "Keep singing." She did. All the way home, her voice bright against the gray Pyongyang afternoon. And Park listened and remembered Kowalski saying, "Music helps us remember we're human," and Callahan saying, "Blues doesn't pretend things are okay," and Billie Holiday singing about seeing someone in all the old familiar places. That night, after Min Jung was asleep, Park sat alone in the small kitchen of their apartment. Soon Yi had gone to bed. The city was quiet beyond the window. Park hummed very softly, so quietly even he could barely hear it. "I'm so lonesome I could cry." The melody was exact. 20 years later, and he hadn't forgotten a single note. The lyrics came back too, in English, in Kowalski's translation, in the memory of 2 young men sitting in a prison compound learning that enemies were human. This was his resistance, this humming, this remembering, this refusal to pretend that the war had been simple, that the enemy had been monsters, that everything the party taught was true. He carried the forbidden knowledge like a weight that never lessened. It was dangerous. It could still destroy him if anyone understood what it meant. But it was also precious, proof that he'd seen beyond the propaganda, that he'd recognized humanity in the people he was supposed to hate. Park was 51 years old. His daughter Min Jung was 22, married to a factory worker, pregnant with her first child. Park's hair had gone gray. His hands shook slightly, nerve damage from an industrial accident 3 years earlier. He still worked at the radio repair shop, still kept his head down, still said nothing controversial. The world had changed around him. The war was ancient history to younger people. The Americans were still the enemy, still imperialists, but the immediate rage had faded into routine hatred. People got on with their lives. They raised children. They worked. They survived. Park survived too, but he carried something they didn't. Memory of a time when the enemy had been real people with names and faces and sadness that sounded exactly like his own. One evening after work, Park walked past a school where children were practicing for a performance. Their voices drifted through open windows, revolutionary songs, patriotic hymns, all the approved music that celebrated the party and the motherland. Park stopped and listened. The children sang well, their voices bright and synchronized. They believed every word they sang, just like Park had believed once, before a prison camp, before a radio, before music taught him that belief was fragile and truth was complicated. A young teacher appeared in the doorway, watching the children practice. She smiled at Park. "Beautiful, isn't it? The next generation, keeping our revolutionary spirit alive." Park nodded politely. "Very beautiful. My grandfather fought in the war," the teacher continued. "He said the Americans were monsters, savages. He said we must never forget what they did to us." Park said nothing. What could he say? That the Americans he'd known had been scared kids who missed their families, that they'd played music instead of torturing prisoners, that one of them had written out song lyrics by hand because he wanted a North Korean radio operator to remember their shared humanity. "Your generation remembers," the teacher said approvingly. "You know the truth about our enemies." Park looked at her young, certain face. She was maybe 25, born after the war. She'd never met an American, never heard their music, never learned that enemies could be decent or that hatred was easier than understanding. "Yes," Park said quietly. "I remember." He walked away, carrying his memories like contraband. The truth wasn't what the teacher thought. The truth was complicated and dangerous and impossible to share. But it was his truth, earned through 20 months in a prison camp, through music that had broken through propaganda, through recognition of humanity and people he was supposed to hate. That night, Park's daughter visited with her husband. They ate dinner together, talking about the baby that would arrive in 3 months. Minjung was worried about being a good mother. Her husband was worried about money, normal worries, human worries. After they left, Park sat alone with Sunyi. She was knitting, focused on the pattern. Park watched her hands move, rhythmic and practiced. "Can I tell you something?" Park asked suddenly. Sunyi looked up, surprised. In 24 years of marriage, Park had rarely volunteered personal information. "During the war," Park continued carefully, "when I was a prisoner, the Americans treated me well. They fed us. They didn't hurt us. They played music." Sunyi's hands stopped moving. Her face showed no expression. This was dangerous territory. Even now, decades later, speaking positively about the enemy could mean investigation, punishment, disappearance. "I learned something there," Park said quietly. "I learned that the people we're taught to hate are just people. They miss home. They love their families. They cry when they're sad." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They're exactly like us." Sunyi was very still. Then slowly she resumed knitting. "That's a dangerous thing to know." "I know. You've carried this for 30 years. "Yes." She knitted in silence for a long moment. Then, "Does it help, knowing that?" Park thought about it. Did it help? It had made his life harder, certainly. Made him question everything. Made him unable to hate cleanly, unable to believe fully, unable to find certainty in ideology. But it had also made him human in a way propaganda couldn't touch. "Yes," Park said finally. "It helps." Sunyi nodded once. She never mentioned it again. But sometimes, late at night, Park heard her humming. Not revolutionary songs. Not patriotic hymns, but something else. Something older. Folk melodies from before the war, from before certainty, from before the world had been divided cleanly into enemies and allies. She understood. She'd always understood. Park was 57. His grandson was 4 years old, bright and curious and full of questions. Minjung brought him to visit on Sundays. The boy liked to sit with Park and listen to stories about old times, though Park carefully edited everything to remove dangerous truths. One Sunday, the boy asked, "Grandfather, what was the war like?" Park looked at his grandson's innocent face. What could he possibly say? That war was chaos and fear and confusion. That the enemy wasn't what propaganda claimed. That music had taught him truths the party wanted erased. "It was hard," Park said simply. "Very hard." "Did you kill Americans?" The boy asked it like he was asking about the weather, casual and curious. "No," Park said. "I was a radio operator. I didn't fight directly." "But you hated them, right? Because they invaded our country?" Park was quiet for a long moment. Minjung watched him carefully, understanding somehow that this question mattered more than it should. "I learned something during the war," Park said slowly. "I learned that people on all sides suffer, that soldiers on both sides miss their families, that everyone wants to go home." The boy frowned, confused. This wasn't what his teachers had taught him. "But the Americans are bad." "Some people are bad, some people are good, most people are just—" Park struggled for words. "Complicated." Minjung intervened gently. "Grandfather is tired. Why don't you play outside?" The boy ran off. Minjung stayed, looking at her father with an expression he couldn't read. "You were a prisoner," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "They treated you well?" "Yes." "You never told me that." Park looked at his daughter. She was smart, perceptive, dangerous qualities in a society that valued obedience over thought. "It's not safe to talk about." "I know." Minjung leaned closer. "But thank you for telling him anyway. For teaching him that people are complicated. He'll need to know that." She paused. "We all need to know that." Park felt his chest tighten. His daughter understood. She'd inherited his dangerous knowledge without him meaning to pass it on. The truth was spreading, quietly, secretly, one generation to the next. "Be careful," Park whispered. "I will," Minjung promised. "But I won't forget. I'll teach my son what you taught me." That voices sound the same, no matter which side they're on. Park Jun-ho died in 1995 at the age of 65. Heart failure, sudden and merciful. He died in his sleep in the small Pyongyang apartment where he'd lived for 40 years. Soon-yi found him in the morning, still and peaceful, finally released from carrying secrets that had weighed on him for decades. At his funeral, Minjung spoke briefly. She talked about her father's quiet strength, his dedication to family, his hard work. She said nothing about the war, about prison camps, about music that had changed everything. But afterward, alone in the apartment, she found something hidden in her father's effects. A piece of paper yellowed with age, covered in strange characters. English words, song lyrics, written in careful handwriting that wasn't her father's. "I'm so lonesome I could cry. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places." Round midnight when it all begins. Minjung didn't understand English, but she understood what the paper meant. Her father had kept it for 42 years, hidden and precious, proof that something real had happened in a prison camp in 1952, that the enemy had been human, that music had carried truth propaganda couldn't erase. She burned the paper that night, as her father should have done decades ago. But first, she memorized the shapes of the letters, the curve of unfamiliar words, the evidence of connection across impossible divides. Then she taught her son to hum, wordless melodies that had no obvious source, no clear origin, just music, sad music, universal music, the kind of music that reminded people they were human, no matter what ideology told them they were supposed to be. And in humming, in teaching, in passing forward the knowledge that voices sound the same no matter which side they're on, Minjung completed what her father had started 40 years earlier in a prison camp where the enemy played music and everything he believed shattered note by note. Park Jun-ho never returned to that camp. Never saw Kowalski or Callahan again. Never learned what happened to them after the war. But he carried them with him for 42 years. Carried their voices. Carried their music. Carried the dangerous truth that enemies are human, and that understanding this is both burden and resistance. He survived by staying silent. But his silence was full of sound, melodies and memories and the weight of recognition that could never be spoken but could never be forgotten. In the end, that was his victory. Not escaping, not being rescued, not changing the system, just remembering, just refusing to pretend that the war had been simple, or the enemy had been monsters, or the truth had been what propaganda claimed. Just humming quietly, in the dark, where no one could hear but everyone who mattered would understand. The music stayed, even after death, even after silence. The music stayed, and that was enough.